elected to the legislature in 1970.
Okay.
So I would have been involved in politics by then.
Well, I ran as a Republican for the Senate, state Senate, and
In Missoula?
lost by Missoula, and lost by 20 votes.
Oh,
And,
no. Who was that? Who beat you?
I don't remember who beat me. They already had the seat, I think. It was, I think, 15, District 50. So, the point was I got better acquainted with the Central Committee in Missoula. We didn't get it all. So I ran as a Democrat and lost by 1 vote. And,
Wait, so you ran a second time as a Democrat?
Yeah, 100. A guy named Ralph Daly won.
Yeah, that was for the House. Yeah, I knew him well. Yeah.
And so by that time I learned what it was costing you guys in terms of time and effort. And I had 2 kids at home and my wife was ill. And so I said, no more Paul, but I'll stick with my institute doing public policy stuff. So you were one of the Republicans that already was, different than Miles City.
Well, I tell you, John,
Never.
I about run my course. I think I sometimes had to try a little harder than some guys, I suppose, to remain a loyal Republican, but I always have been. I never voted for a Democrat for president until this last time. But I can't take this Trump guy.
Yeah.
And
He's not a Republican.
I don't think he's anything but he's an egomaniac who's loyal to himself entirely, totally, and I just so disgusted by how that could have even happened. And I see of the Republicans have fallen into line behind him. You know, there are only 9% of them, according to the Pew poll I saw here a couple of weeks ago, that they don't have a favorable opinion of him.
Wow.
Only 9% of Republicans have an unfavorable opinion of Trump. Oh my God! I mean,
What happened to the Republicans?
well, he's just such an obvious phony and such an obvious demagogue that even if you thought you agreed with him philosophically and you couldn't count on him for anything anyway, you could still spot him for the charlatan he is, regardless of whether you think of yourself as a Democrat or Republican. And so I just...
Well, that's one reason I wanted to do this track. David and I both grew up here. We were both in Boys State. I was in the first Boys State club. That we both made our careers at Dillon.
Yeah, I was a counselor for 25 years at Boys State at Dillon.
Great, it's a good program.
Great program.
At any rate, we've had our lives outside of here, but we've also he took over the ranch and he's been involved here for off and on for years. So for me, it was at 87, it's a kind of a last shot at having energy and time to go around Montana and see places I saw only once or twice during the Institute days when we did a lot of projects. David was involved at a distance because he was full-time professor at Missouri then, but he was interested also. So after Trump, after again 4 Montana's got an image, globally, and whether you're on one side or the other, it got on the front page of the New York Times, of the Wall Street Journal, of the Washington Post, and that's what Montana. And I thought, geez, is that Montana? I was a Republican. I was a Democrat. There are Montanans like that. I have classmates like that. Warren Little, we interviewed him.
He was brought up a Democrat. I know him, but like I was telling David, he couldn't get a piece of onion skin paper to the right of him now.
Okay, you know that.
Right. He got mad at in my Kiwanis club and quit over some trivial kind of a political deal, and I don't know. I've just kind of been careful of him. He sent me an email after I wrote my op-ed piece, about Trump. And I think I didn't respond, so he called me up and he was going to tell me off. And we talked for, 10 or 15 minutes, I guess, and I kind of talked him down.
Yeah.
So...
you can talk him down, but you can't change his mind.
Yeah, I don't know what happened with him, but he had some kind of something or other that...
If we had more time, I'll tell you what happened to him, but I won't.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of too bad, because I've known him for, 20 years or something, and I remember he always was kind of traditional and, proud of being an anti-communist and FBI and that sort of thing, but he kind of went some way or other.
Yeah. But he's got people like him who are in my class. Dave Hurt, who had a publication up the Bitterroot. He lives near Lolo on a kind of horse farm,
Yeah.
but he inherited from his dad. I mean, he's not a self-made guy, but he trumpets this notion of a real Montana as a self-made guy. He put together a target with Hillary and Barack's faces on it and took it to the Republican session at the Edgewater and parked it outside. It was on a trailer and with bullet holes in it. And whoever was the GOP person there made him leave, which pissed him off. But that's who Dave Hurt is. We were in Paxton School together. And
So I read about that in the paper. Dave Hurt was the one who did that.
and I planned to have him interviewed yesterday, and I couldn't find his phone number. But I didn't try very hard. But he always needles me because through the years, and I needle him. But since Trump, I quit being involved because.
Now, Bob, what sort of reaction have you gotten from your op-ed piece?
It was mostly negative on the Hillary one. And I think the negativism came more from the fact that I did you remember it? Did either one of you see it?
No,
Yeah.
I heard about it.
Well, I kind of tried to make the debater's case for, all the reasons not to vote for Trump. And then
Not hard.
And I didn't think it was hard. And then the conclusion was essentially that Hillary, well, not particularly my philosophical roommate, wouldn't risk the country in some kind of screwball kinds of inconsistent kinds of things that Trump might do. That she'd probably keep us on an even keel, and I said we survived 8 years of Obama. I didn't vote for him either time, but we survived 8 years of Obama in reasonably good shape, and that she'd be more or less, I thought, an extension of him. And I wasn't willing to take the chance on Trump, and I had some friends who said, well, we don't like him either, so we're going to vote for the Libertarian, or we're going to vote for the Green Party candidate. And to me, that's a cop-out. If you really think this guy's dangerous, then the only choice to beat him is Hillary. You just throw away your vote, and you can feel self-righteously good about it, but that doesn't help save the country if this guy is really a danger to the country. So that's what I did, and there were a lot of my old Republican friends who'd been talking to each other about how horrible Hillary is for 20 years, and they thought, well, we don't care who he is. I mean, nobody could possibly be as bad as Hillary, and I never really fully understood that. She certainly wouldn't have been my first choice. John Kasich was the guy I supported all the way through until he went down. But so anyway, I just thought, well, it's a painful decision to have to make for a lifelong Republican, but it's not a difficult decision. And but I caught hell for that, but also some Democrats, who congratulated me for finally coming around and seeing light,
And you said, I'm not doing this because I like Democrats. I'm doing this because I really don't like Trump.
But the problem, John, is now, and I think maybe both of you kind of see this, I don't know, is that we've got guys who've taken over the Republican Party, like Gianforte and some of these other ones that I just think are kind of unreasonable, and I'm not on board much anymore. I just can't help it. And so, I'm not ready to say I'm a Democrat. I'm probably not even ready to say I'm an independent. You don't like to give up on your, the party of yours that was born into the Republican Party. But I just, I find myself voting for more Democrats than Republicans. Well, that's got to tell you something. If that's really happening, then maybe you're just trying to fool yourself. I don't know.
Well, the reason I came out as a Republican, I was back in Washington. I was teaching at Johns Hopkins at SAIS, and my wife had a stroke, and we were both born in Missoula, and we knew she wasn't going to survive. So I got to find a way to make a living and stay in Missoula, where she wants to be, and where we had some other friends. So we came out, and I set up the institute, but I also wanted to be involved in politics. So there were a couple of Republicans I've gotten close to.
Tom Paine?
One was Al Quie, who later subsequently became governor of Missouri.
Oh, yeah.
Or, Minneapolis.
I didn't know he was ever in Montana.
Well, Al Quie
You just knew him from Minnesota.
I knew him in district. They were in Congress. And I did quite a bit of testifying for different issues.
Okay.
And that's how I got to know Al Quie.
Yeah.
Actually, I got to know him Aspen, Colorado, at a big event we had there, which I won't go into. But, and the other was Charles Moser, another Republican. Oberlin is in his district, and if you understand Oberlin, you understand Charles Moser.
Oberlin,
I'm sorry,
what state?
Ohio.
Okay.
The northern part of Ohio.
Okay, that's a
Oberlin's
college.
A
Oberlin
great
College.
college
Yeah,
up
okay.
there, and you know they're liberal, but they're middle of the road, and they got a few Republicans. But those two guys were terrific, and they were my kind of guys, and I want to be with that party. I come back to Montana, and I had a person in Missoula who was pushing me, a cousin, and in fact we're going over and interview his son. So he said, it'll be all right. This is a guy who was a Bird Society member, had been a chief petty officer in the Navy. He said, I'll bring him around. And, so I lost by a few votes. And I knew in talking to some other committee members, they were not happy with this professor from the East. I'm not from the East. I grew up here. I went to the university, went to high school. Nah, you're out of here. You've been too well educated. You're too much educated. So you've been there.
You were.
Are we doing recording?
Yeah, we are.
Okay.
I'm trying. There was a lot of noise around.
Yeah,
So,
and
I don't have a magic bullet, but I'm just trying maybe
Sure.
to help. At
Most
least,
of this is not going to be used.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's right. It's not like a TV. It's
Okay,
really
yeah, maybe I should
John and David.
sit up and get my coffee cup out of the way.
Yeah, it's kind of a cars there and all
Yeah.
carts and.
It might help if I got a little closer to this, I suppose, too, huh? My voice isn't strong, so.
Yeah, if you're right next, that'll be good.
Okay.
Okay, you were Secretary of State at the time of deregulation.
Oh, I think deregulation occurred in about the 1997 legislative session. Maybe it was the 1999 session. And I had been a legislator through the 95 session, state senator. And I didn't get elected Secretary of State until 2000. So
okay.
electrical dereg kind of happened between me.
What happened there? How did that go through? And what were the forces?
Well, I remember something about it. There was a period of time there when a lot of public officials and elected officials and so on, I think all over the country, felt that deregulation was a good thing generally. And I don't remember where President Clinton felt or fit into that. He would have been president at the time, but he was somebody that was kind of interested, I think, as much as anything in going with the flow and so on. The interest in dereg was probably a more part of the more laissez-faire Republican philosophy than the Democratic philosophy. And other states, I think, had experimented with deregulation, and the big deregulation thing during that period was airline deregulation. And people pointed to it, I think, as a good example or a bad example, depending. And Montana was considered sort of a bad example because we were a rural state, and so it was harder to make the free market work where there wasn't a big concentration of people to fly on the airplanes. But somehow or other it got sold to the Montana legislature anyway. I can't truthfully tell you who had the majority, which party had the majority. It was real close generally during that period. In 97 probably, maybe 99. And but anyway, it passed with a bipartisan majority. I know that.
And I'm asking especially about electrical deregulation.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Okay.
Electrical deregulation kind of was an idea that kind of followed in the wake of the airline deregulation, and I think there were efforts to deregulate other state-regulated businesses during that time, but electrical deregulation was a big focus in Montana. And there's a conspiracy theory about it. Hadn't thought about this for a long time, but there's a conspiracy theory about it that Montana Power Company was interested in selling off its assets. And so what would benefit them would be to have their stock value increase a lot at about the time they wanted to sell. And so anyway, their feeling was, and this is maybe kind of a far-fetched conspiracy, that if they could get the prices deregulated, that would appear that their company could be a lot more profitable, the value of their stock would rise, and then they'd sell it. And that's what they had in mind all along. I truthfully have no idea, but I've heard that.
I've heard that.
Yeah, you've heard that
I've known
too.
people who really believe that.
And it could be. And so anyway, they were pitching for it, and they've had influence in the legislature over the years, and there wasn't any real concentrated Democrat opposition to it, I don't think, anyway. I wasn't in the legislature. And it was controversial, no question about that. I think Governor Roscoe, has been tagged now as kind of the villain who was behind the scenes and who made it happen. But I don't remember him as having a particularly high profile. But he must have backed it. And so it did pass, and he signed it into law. And then, you remember Enron? Very well. I think, didn't Enron buy it? I think that's right. Because then when Roscoe, after his term expired, went to work for Enron, there were people who thought, well, this was a conspiracy. Roscoe had to benefit from this. Montana Power Company, this sounds suspicious too. Their stock price skyrocketed after the deregulation legislation passed, and then they sold it. I think Enron. Wasn't Enron?
They sold most of the, they sold the PPL, and then I sold the production facility, and transmission support they sold to Northwestern University.
I should have known that.
But Enron was somehow involved in it. Enron had, one of the theories certainly is that Enron was involved in getting the deregulation through. And somehow
All your action verbs are proper now.
Okay, all right. Well, then I should have remembered that too. So the names were sold to the
right.
generation facilities, and Northwest Energy, I think, out of South Dakota, bought the telephone poles or whatever, and the lines and the distribution part of it. That's right. Okay. Well, anyway, if I knew more about quite how Enron fit into the thing, but anyway, it happened. Montana Power sold when their stock was very high, and then it plummeted. They went too far into.
And all the retirees, all the
they
people
got
who have
killed.
spent their lives.
Yeah,
Well,
retirees. Some of them I knew, pretty well, and they just lost their whole retirement when the stock market plummeted after the power company stock was sold, or after it skyrocketed.
It plummeted because they put the money into telecommunication.
Yeah, they put
set
it
up
into optic wires or optic something or others,
Right.
and they didn't go in the direction that the technology was going in, I guess, anyway. But it was a terrible disaster.
Right, and so their company was, I think, Tele-America.
Touch America, Tell America, Touch something America.
Something of that sort.
Yeah.
And it was what went rogue.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
had-
Touch America, Mike.
We're going to run out of time.
I'm
Can
sorry,
we get
okay.
to some of the...
But
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
Well, I didn't do a very good job so far because you guys had to straighten me out.
you have been a statewide officer for years. You made led legislation that affected the state. One of the things we're interested in is the eastern and western Montana, and the patterns. What is your feeling about how things are going in eastern Montana?
Oh, I
especially?
see. Well, I guess I know less about eastern Montana, but energy has been a big source of their economic development, certainly in recent years with the Bakken development, and of course coal in eastern Montana has been important around Colstrip, and the Bakken field, I guess, some of it is in far eastern Montana. And then as both you know, agriculture, cattle and sheep and grain and so forth has been the mainstay of eastern Montana for most of Montana history. And the west is a little different than that. And politically, there have always been some differences too, I think. In the eastern part of the state has been traditionally conservative in its politics, but not usually radically conservative. The real radicalness, if that's a word, in the politics in Montana has been pretty much in the valleys in the west, where you've had the extreme left-wingers and the extreme right-wingers. And you find them in pockets more in the western part of the state than in the eastern part of the state. There used to be an old story, not much of a quote or anything, that if you wanted to keep out of trouble in the politics of a lot of rural Montana, which meant essentially eastern Montana, just keep out of trouble with gas and oil and grain and cattle, and the people would put up with you. They didn't much care what your philosophy was beyond that. And those are things that don't lead anybody in a very radical direction, at least in modern history. There was the era of the prairie populace, you know, back in the 20s and so forth, where there was some pretty radical politics in eastern Montana that kind of slipped over from North Dakota and Minnesota. But for the most part, where your dad was a legislator from, you know, it was fairly easy to, his world wasn't real volatile, and I think he could have probably kept his legislative seat, as a lot of those guys did, were reelected over there, with just kind of basically taking care of business, and the people would leave them alone after that. But in the western part of the state, you had Jerry O'Connell, and you had young Lee Metcalf, and you had the John Birchers that you're talking about. And so politics was a little more rougher, was a rougher bronc to ride, I think, in areas around Bozeman and Kalispell and Missoula and so on in the east. Now, when we see the economy slipping across the state, we see the state revenues in decline and so on. A lot of that is due to the decline in the Bakken oil development, and the price is down for coal, because there's a general feeling around the country that coal is a serious pollutant and that we ought to discourage, the businesses shouldn't use as much of it, and they aren't, and that's affecting the price of coal. So eastern Montana is in decline economically, and that's not unusual. And so,
Could I ask
yeah, you bet.
more general question
you bet.
related to that? It's climate change. And
Yes.
do you think, what's your feeling about Montana coal? Do you think in the last 40 years we've contributed to
Well,
this?
if I lived over there, I'd probably be real protective of it.
Yes.
You can understand why they are over there, but golly, as I look at it, I think in a more objective way, I'm persuaded that there's certainly something to climate change. If somebody said, well, Bob, could you prove that the reason that seasons, the warm seasons are longer and the cold seasons are shorter and all these kinds of things, or to the extent they are, it's because of a man-caused problem, I'd say I couldn't prove that, and I don't know that. But it's not hard for me to understand how man must be contributing to it, because we're putting a lot more stuff in the air now than we ever have before.
If you use the word science at that point and say, well, the science says X, Y, or Z, does that ring any bells?
I'm not a scientist, and if you place scientific evidence before me, I'm not sure I'd fully understand it. But I guess I'm persuaded that there's got to be something to it, and something pretty significant to it, because the people who I respect and who have a handle on science seem to think that there's definitely a man-caused important part of what's happening in the climate. And then if you look at the glaciers up in Glacier Park, right here in my world, you know, the glaciers were essentially unchanged, or not very much changed, until something like 60 years ago, and now they're just evaporating.
Yeah.
And so something's being accelerated, and you think, well, what could that be? And you look over the eons of time, and you think, well, you know, man pumping a lot of coal smoke and that sort of thing into the atmosphere has largely happened since the industrial age. And so it seems to kind of fit that what's warming things up is heavily contributed to by man-caused factors. So I would hope that we would discourage the use of those kinds
well, you know,
of
that's a
causes.
global issue, and one of the issues that interests, I think, both David and me is Montana really different than the rest of the United States? Is there such a thing as a Montana voice that is different than a Wyoming voice or an Idaho voice? And climate change is generally skeptical. Most people are skeptical in this part of the woods.
Right.
Nowadays, I live over in the state of Washington, and the majority of Washington voters think it's real. Not so much people down around the Palouse country, but where most people live.
Yeah. Well, I think we always used to think that politically, Idaho, had elected people like Frank Church and
They did.
Gracie Fost, I remember, was a pretty solid liberal, and so on.
Andrus.
And well, Cecil Andrus, a little more moderate, but
Yeah.
that Idaho was definitely a state that could elect Democrats and liberal Democrats. So could Montana with Metcalf and Mansfield and Murray and so forth. And Wyoming, even until recently, has had Democrat governors. But they're all regarded as solidly red states in terms of presidential elections. And I think the thought patterns are pretty similar, although Wyoming and Idaho got solidly into the Republican column about a decade before Montana did. Now I think Montana's pretty much there, and I think Tester's going to have the fight of his life when he comes up for election next year.
He thinks they already got 50 million against him.
Is that right? Yeah, I
I'm
wouldn't be
talking to him.
surprised.
We didn't get to interview him for this program because it was just serendipity, but
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised.
that's
at
his
that.
nightmare, or
Could-
his wife's nightmare.
Well, he's got to be showing up. He's the outlier. He's the least. They're both senators from Wyoming are ours. Both of them from Idaho are ours. The polls show that Daines is very popular in Montana and Tester not so much. But I think there hasn't been a nickel made betting against Tester yet. And he beat Burns, who was a three-term incumbent.
Yeah.
And he was upset. He won in an upset when he did that. And then Rehberg had been elected to Congress 10 times, had run statewide 10, or not 10 times, but 5 times. And Tester had only run statewide once. And Tester beat Rehberg. So Tester's certainly no pushover. And he's a kind of a, we've always in Montana too, I think, had somewhat of a preference since Lee Metcalf for kind of soft-boiled Democrats. I mean, Ted Schwinden was a absolutely honest-to-God cowboy, as governor or grain grower. He was very rural in his approach, and he was real conservative with money. And Max Baucus was always very careful and fairly moderate, maybe even quite moderate in his voting record. And Melcher was pretty much the same way. So Montanans, I think, have had somewhat of a preference for moderate Democrats and even to some extent moderate Republicans, Mark Roscoe being an example of that.
Yeah.
But now I think it's really kind of drifted beyond that point, and I think Montanans seem to have a preference for Republicans, period.
So you think it isn't just the dark money coming in? You think
Well, I think that probably influences that. I mean, if you were a guy that was looking to buy a Senate seat, if you were a big, well-financed PAC, and you were looking to buy a U.S. Senate seat, if you looked around the country, you'd think just based on, what we've talked about here, that one lone Democrat trying to survive in Montana is probably as easy a pickings as those guys would have anywhere in the country. And if it costs $50 million to do it, they'll probably do it,
Well, my impression of Whitefish.
Or they'll try to do it. I mean.
Whitefish has one of the pockets, as you said, some radicals, and big money has come in here, as well as people with big visions of evil. Whitefish suddenly is on the front pages of some of the newspapers because of white supremacy.
Have you been affected at all by Richard Spencer?
No, and frankly, you guys, I think that's more of a media thing than anything else.
Okay, that's why
Honestly,
we're here.
I think so. Whitefish of the legislative districts in this part of Montana is about the only one that elects Democrats. And Whitefish has got the ski resort, so the ski kids are here, a lot of the time, and they're working part-time. Whitefish has got big money. We have got limousine liberals all over the place.
Well, Corky helped bring some in.
Yeah, sure. So, and they tend to be liberal in their approach, and the kids tend to be. So Whitefish is a sort of a mini Missoula. Missoula is sort of a mini Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon, sort of a mini San Francisco, But this is a kind of an artsy, craftsy place more than the rest of Montana here in Whitefish. And it'd be an unlikely place for some horrible neo-Nazis to move in and try to take over. There'd be a lot of easier places in Montana to do that. But Spencer's connection was that his folks apparently had some money and bought a business here. a little boutique kind of a business of some kind or other, and that's what attracted him here and to ski.
Artful kind of and that brings me back here. I'm interested in the culture more than I am the politics, really. And one of the things, it seems like you're able to swim in the culture of moderation, and that affects your politics. But the other parts of your life and the parts that affect, I've got a lot of kinfolk living in Kalispell, and some of them were Democrats once upon a time, but they're all uniformly Republicans now. And the culture is such. Their father, my sister, went to Cutbank and made their life in Cutbank. And Cutbank has a very specific kind of subculture that is different, quite different than Kalispell. And these kids don't. They were doctors, and they thrive. Kalispell, and they really fit. So I'm wondering what really is happening in the mind, if anything. You mentioned moderation among Republicans, and there's a culture of that, about music, about clothing, about language. And it strikes me these people are that way. They're moderate. None of them are radical, but they voted for Trump.
Well, I just don't understand Trump, I guess. I don't know.
I think they voted. My explanation, I think, is the one you gave, that they just don't think a lot. It's Republican, and they just didn't want Hillary. They didn't want to throw their vote away. So
Well,
that's where it is.
Yeah, and it's overwhelming in Montana. Trump carried Montana over 60% of the vote, I think, so 65% or something like that. Well, Cutbank's more real Montana. We used to joke about, I've got some cousins in the Winifred area north of Lewistown. They've got a big ranch up in the Missouri River Breaks. And when we go there, we go to Montana.
Yeah.
Because this isn't Montana. I mean, I'd like to, I'm a lifelong Montana. I was born in Missoula, and I've grown up all my life around this part of Montana, but this is the least typical part of Montana. Only 20% of Montana is west of the Divide. 80% of Montana is east of the Continental Divide.
80% of the land area?
Land area, yeah.
What about the population?
Oh, no, the population is, I don't know, but
Almost
it's...
the reverse.
Well, I don't know if it was reversed or not, but it's maybe close to 50-50, even though it's just in 20% of it. But you see, Billings is still the biggest town in the state, of course. And Great Falls is still big and important. But Missoula and Kalispell and Bozeman are all growing rapidly. And people like to move into this. They like this ambiance.
But they're not moving into Cutbank.
No, they're not moving into Cutbank.
Or
And
Scobie,
the
or
eastern part of the
Shelby.
state's in decline in terms of population and so on, which causes some resentment. It's always been there, the people, joke with each other about the fact that nobody ever moves from Whitefish to retire in Scobie, but a lot of people move from Scobie to retire
That's
in
right.
Whitefish.
And that's certainly the case with the Osborns, who are my kin.
Yeah.
Well, that's what is interesting to me. Montana's quite dynamic now. You described Montana, and I've accepted that, pretty much your description. But I know damn well Cutbank is not in any way the future of Montana.
Yeah, that's
Here's the future of Montana. You're part of it. And I think, just my hypothesis, the brain change that's occurred to you is what, in fact, Montana is becoming. The real Montana is not fundamentally radical, the way Gianforte would has interpreted it. Well, the real Montana's full of these bastards who beat journalists up, and I don't believe that at all. But I don't believe the real Montana anymore is Cutbank and Shelby.
Well, I just got to tell you, I've always kind of thought of myself as one of the ones that kind of had the best handle on what was going on. I've always tried to really pay attention and to talk to everybody.
Yes.
And this district was tougher than the dickens for a Republican to win to begin with when I first started winning here. But I went down to the rail yards and I talked to all those guys, who had virtually never voted for Republicans, and kind of tried to figure out what they were thinking about things. And then the sawmills were unionized, and I kind of tried to understand them, and the history of that sort of thing fascinates me, And so I managed to put it together. So I think I won something like 8 or 9 straight elections here for the legislature, right around here. And to begin with, it was really tough for a Republican to win. And now Whitefish itself still is tough for a Republican to win, but the right kind of Republican could win here easily. But the group that's taken over the Republican Party can't really win here. Although you'd be surprised at the loggers and the mill workers, not many of them left anymore because a lot of that whole industry is closed down. And a lot of the railroaders, I'm sure they voted for Trump. Those blue-collar guys, a lot of them did. They see him as kicking over an establishment that they think doesn't care about them, and somehow or other they seem to think this guy who was born with millions of dollars fortune is somebody that cares about them. And how that it is more than anything, I think, just the fact that he was anti-establishment. And the whole country, many of the people in the whole country at least, seem to believe that the country's on the wrong track. And I've attributed it around here, but I don't know why it wouldn't also be the case over much of the country, to one individual. And that's one a whole lot of them listen to on the radio every day, and it's Rush Limbaugh. And he's very persuasive and extremely
Why
far
do you
over to
think
the right.
he is persuasive?
He seems to have kind of found the niche for where the common man, I think it's more men than women, could kind of be, it's kind of like it's us little guys fighting against the big evil establishment. And it has something to do, too, with the college boys. It's a kind of an anti-intellectual thing. It's a struggling small business. It's the government workers all have their retirement pretty well secure, and they don't need to worry about the future. Whereas a small struggling businessman in the gravel pit business or the water heater business or the car business or something like that has got to make right decisions and got to do everything right and work Saturdays and Sundays and so on to make it. And he's constantly at risk. And Rush is pushing for him and cheering for him and not these government employees. So he's very anti-government, and most government employees probably hate him and don't listen to him. But a lot of these people around here, the truck drivers, the guys that work for the railroad and have a lot of time during the day, have kind of got drawn into him, and I think he has an enormous influence. I think he does around here, and I'll bet he does nationwide.
Do you think he had an impact on the Republican Party in
the whole
Montana?
country, I think. Yeah, I think definitely. Yeah, I think he's a huge, important opinion leader, and he's almost a cult leader, because they just seem to mark lots. I talk to some of my old friends, about political things once in a while, and you can hear what he's been saying on the radio. I don't listen to him that often, but often enough to kind of keep track of him to the extent I can, and I hear it repeated right back to me. I'm sure he's got great influence, and.
I have made that argument often in my lectures, and I use the example particularly of my mother, who was a moderate Republican, served on Governor Aronson's Child Welfare Committee, and especially a lot of things like that.
Uh-huh.
And when Rush Limbaugh went national in '89, she started listening, and she became a devotee. And she became far more conservative, and I remember at one point we were discussing politics, and she was using an argument, and I turned to her and I said, "Mom, that's a Rush Limbaugh argument. I'm not some unknown liberal. I'm your son." And she said, "Yeah, I learned that from Rush Limbaugh."
Well, the same thing happened to my dad, David. Same thing happened to my dad. He was doing good.
No, good.
Yeah, he was a retiree, and he had a lot of time on his hands, and he'd even carry Rush around in a little old transistor radio in his pockets, when he was out doing stuff. We had a little farm ranch out west of town here, and he was always a Republican. But this guy was kind of the guy that had the guts to take on the evil Bill Clinton, and so my dad just seemed to have bought into him probably the last 10 years of his life. So maybe that's kind of what shapes my opinion too. I mean, I saw, how the influence he had on my dad, and I think he's got more influence now than ever.
Okay. Well, so how about Beck? Beck comes from out of Seattle, right? And that's an aside.
Bill Beck, the state legislator?
No,
Oh.
no, he's a
Glenn Beck.
Oh, Glenn Beck, yeah. He's not as big a presence. Hannity is maybe somewhat comparable to Limbaugh
yes,
on
he
television,
is.
and
He's
they're
the TV
equally
version of Limbaugh.
kind of radical in my opinion.
But Fox is, again and again, the only TV station we could find with national news is Fox. And the first place I've been able to get MSNBC up here, the guy who was the night watchman who helped me find it said, I didn't know that station existed. And he's been working 5 years up at the where we
Big
stayed.
Mountain, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that's
Channel
this
51.
can't be unique to Montana. What we're talking about,
Yeah.
Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and that sort of thing. And I don't know that it's had more influence on people in Montana than other places, but
Bob, let me ask you about Montana newspapers.
yeah.
And you've done lots of interviews about the Anaconda papers. Now we've got the Lee newspapers and Gannett papers and so forth. And you've had op-eds in them. What's the pattern on Montana newspapers nowadays?
Well, I think there was the widespread opinion leading up into the 50s for sure that we had a controlled press in Montana.
Right.
And Joseph Kinsey Howard, had wrote the book Montana High, Wide, and Handsome, and he was a sort of a prairie populist kind of a guy who was very critical of the Anaconda Company and the establishment, and he made a case in that book that the press is controlled in Montana, and that we were the only state in Montana where you could say that there wasn't really a free press. Well, I've looked into that a little bit, and there was a law firm in Helena, actually. It'll come to me. A guy's name was Tyler Weir, who was a partner in the law firm that Tom Walsh had been a partner of years ago in Helena. And it was pointed out to me by somebody in one of my interviews, I guess, that if you were a newspaper editor for any one of the any one of the Anaconda Company papers, and you had a question about a story, best thing to do was to check in with Mr. Weir in Helena. And they were, by then, less concerned about just crucifying somebody like Joe Dixon when they really went after him, but more concerned by the 50s in just not giving any unnecessary publicity to some radical rascal that they were going to have trouble controlling if he was elected to public office, and to give more attention to things that were not hurtful to them politically. They, for example, apparently didn't like to have mine accidents reported widely around the state, and anything like that. But they were way more benign in the 50s, but they were resented still by then. People thought you didn't really get the real true news when you read the Missoulian or the Billings Gazette or that sort of thing. So they sold. They weren't making much money off their papers, as I understand it. They thought the future's already has gone to radio, and it's going rapidly toward television, and more people get their news that way. So maybe this is a good time to just get rid of those darn things, because we get criticized for them, and we don't get much back from them. So they sold to Lee in 1959, and but neither here nor there, not probably an important part of what this interview needs to be about. But what happened was clear back during the War of the Copper Kings. The two Copper Kings were vying against each other all the time, so they bought newspapers, both the little county weeklies and the dailies. And then after Clark moved back to Washington, somehow or other, his papers, many of them ended up with the Anaconda Company papers, so they owned most of the dailies in the state, but they also owned a fair number of the weeklies, and they got rid of a lot of those, but they continued to advertise in the weeklies even though they didn't need to. The Anaconda Company didn't have anything to sell in the Roundup Herald, or something like that, but they wanted to be able to If they needed to have they usually had a lawyer on retainer in these communities. They didn't have very much legal work.
Yeah.
But if the company needed to get a good news story out, they'd call up their friend Bill Johnson, the lawyer in Glendive,
Yeah.
and say, can you go in and talk to the newspaper publisher or whatever it takes and see if you can get him to do a story on this, and these are the things we'd kind of like to have emphasized. Well, he doesn't want to lose that nice display ad he has, periodically in there, and that got paid for by the Anaconda Company or the Montana Power Company, because they had more of a reason to advertise around the state. And they know the lawyer, and it doesn't seem unreasonable. So they do that. So they had not a controlling influence, but heavy influence in Montana, clear up at least through the 50s. And there's even, some little lingering of that today,
But what about today?
Well, there are still, I suppose
How
there.
are the newspapers effective today?
Well, no. The big Montana Power Company and the Anaconda Company are gone.
Yeah, right.
But I think there's the banks and the Chamber of Commerce and the stock growers and so on are still the establishment, if you could call it that, in Montana. And they're probably members of the editorial boards that are still part of that establishment.
Well,
And
the establishment in Helena,
it's probably just a little whisper of an influence left, and it's probably not much different than most states, now. But it was different, I think, in the, from the time the ACM got together and got things pretty well consolidated during and after World War I until about 1959 or 60, we had a kind of a closed shop in Montana.
Well, there's a strong argument against CNN and against all of the public media, PBS, by people who are claiming, I have no idea where Trump is, but there's a coagulation of people who've always been hostile to public radio, public television, and so forth. So I'm sensing there's a real possibility that the Republicans may have hung around this horseshoe around their neck. Because I've known the Republicans I knew were great promoters, not just of that, but of NASA and a lot of public operations. But now you've got this hostility so fundamental that anything that Washington touches, they want to get rid of.
And I've got a thought on that too. You're the guy that's interested in culture, right? Like the political culture. And I think, if I remember, thought I might even write something about this sometime. Because I've followed politics since I was a little kid. I've always been really interested in it. I was one of the few little kids that read U.S. News World Report, when I was in the 5th grade. And so then, Kalispell was more or less a Republican town. And the lady who was the dentist's wife, or the lawyer's wife, or the architect's wife, she was a Republican. And college-educated people generally were Republicans, even a lot of school teachers. And the Democrat was the guy who raised hogs out on the edge of town, or was trying to make it in a little gravel pit, or was a Jippo logger, up in the woods someplace, a blue-collar guy with an 8th grade education or maybe a high school education. And so there was even a kind of a class difference, between the two parties. And the Democrats had at least somewhat of an advantage here during that period of time, because the aluminum plant and all the sawmills around here were unionized.
There's no question without that Mansfield would not have been elected.
Probably so. Probably so.
And I don't think Metcalf would have been.
And Mansfield also, I think, was one who believed that the farmers' union in the east and the industrial unions in the west, the sawmills and the mines, those things combined in the two parts of the state helped the Democrats enormously, and it helped them enormously with a statewide organization that the Republicans didn't have. And this business too, about the newspapers, were controlled by the Republicans. There's a lot of horse hockey. The company papers, if you were a good Democrat and kept out of trouble with them, they didn't have any trouble supporting you at all.
How do you feel about Lee now?
Well, I think they've gone. You notice that similar editorials will sometimes show up in the 4 big
Right.
newspapers, the IR in Helena, the Missoulian, the Butte Standard, and the Billings Gazette. And they tend to be more liberal than the state population, but not radically so.
Right.
So that's the newspapers, if anything now, the big newspapers, if anything now, are a moderating influence. But most of the people who watch Fox News, they don't take the Missoulian anymore. They've got them figured out.
Right.
So
Not many people take the Missoulian anymore.
the papers, the big papers that I'm one of these old-fashioned guys that likes to hold a newspaper and with a cup of coffee when I'm one of the first things I do.
That's probably
during the
what
day.
you were doing this morning.
It was, yeah. Well,
I
I
hope
was
so.
actually, but I had a couple of more things on my mind, and I can't imagine how I spaced it out. But anyway, I did. So I'm going to really miss newspapers if they actually pass
Yeah.
from the scene.
We're going to run out of time, and
Yep.
health is an issue
You bet.
that we wanted to cover. Is Montana health care declining, improving, and does Medicaid and Medicare national policies have a major role to play
I
in the
think they
future?
do, and I haven't followed it that closely, but Montana has an aging population. We're in the bottom 5 or 6 states, I think, in terms of age, yeah. And so that's bound to affect us more than other states, just that demographic fact. And we were one of the states too, incredibly, our legislature was one of the something like 18 or something, I think, around the country that expanded Medicaid,
Sorry.
expanded Medicaid coverage. And that,
I've been waiting.
And so, anyway, when Congress is getting rid of Obamacare and going back to the basics in terms of medical care, it more impacts states like Montana than other states. And something like, I've seen the number and I don't remember, but something like 34,000 Montanans will see major reductions in their access to medical care as the result of repealing Medicaid expansion. So I think that and the aging population probably mean Montana is a little more impacted than most states.
Is that going to be felt more in the rural areas?
I think so. Yeah, I think it will be felt more in the rural areas than probably the more urbanized areas. Funny thing too, because we think of, of a place like Whitefish as an urban area in Montana, but it wouldn't show up that way nationally. It's got such a small town that most of Montana would probably be regarded as rural. But I think the more rural parts of the state where hospitals have already closed down, and you might have one doctor and he's from India or Nepal or someplace or other, and he serves some big area, around Jordan and, whatever. Those places will probably be more impacted. And,
Do you think that sentiment leads people? What I'm interested in is, what does conservative mean anymore to Montana? And I've talked to people who say I'm a conservative, but then you talk about health care.
Yeah.
And the hospital in Conrad, which is a clinic, they want that money kept.
Right.
And
people are protective of their own local hospital, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So, but I think I'm not sure people really realize or understand, the implications of this whole healthcare deal. Can I say one thing? I know we're out of time, but I just want to go back and touch on something I think that might be kind of important in our interview. I was about to tell you that when I was a kid, the professional people and the college-educated people and the people who lived in Kalispell, which was the big town around here, were all Republicans, virtually all. And the blue-collar, hard-working, less well-educated people, especially those in the evangelical churches, tended to be Democrats. The old mainline churches, mainline Protestant churches in particular, most of those congregations were Republican. That's done an absolute flip-flop here in the Flathead Valley and probably in a lot of the rest of the country. And now you find upper-income people, well-educated people are generally more liberal, and the blue-collar working stiff and his family who didn't have an opportunity for a college education and don't necessarily consider higher education that important even still, are the ones that are totally in the Trump camp, and they're making the Republican Party really conservative. They seem to buy into that sort of nationalistic, it's us little people against those big people kind of an approach that really actually maybe was always, there. It was just that the little people were for FDR back during the Depression, and now they're for Trump. But they're a lot of the same demographic, I think. And I'm not sure how to fully understand that. But,
Do you think fear is
fear
significant role?
Fear can easily be radicalized, I think. And I think we see that. We see a technology transforming our whole country and our whole world, and a lot of folks don't know whether they're going to get left out in that and how that's going to affect them and their kids and their grandkids. People who are a little more confident about that, I think, tend to be a little bit less radical and maybe irrationally radical.
Yeah.
But I think Trump has played to that anxiety beautifully.
I keep looking at both Democrats and Republicans to fit in my gut what is the future, the kind of leader. And I look at Sass, Senator Sass, Ben Sass, and I think, well, maybe he's a Republican for the future.
Yeah.
He's a younger version of Casey. I like Casey too. And then I look at Democrats, and right now I don't see any Democrat who fits. There's a lot of Democrats who want to be. But David,
Yeah.
do you think somebody, a counterpart to Ben Sass?
Elizabeth Warren.
She doesn't fit at all.
Well,
She's very radical. Her speech is right. She's a female. And the point that I think Bob is making is where Montanans are like a lot of other people in the United States. They want the comfort of realizing the future is not that different from the past.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth Warren is a voice that's very different from the past, any past successful politician.
She, I think, has appeal, though.
Oh, yeah.
Bernie Sanders won in the Montana primary.
Yeah, and I'm a
So
Bernie Sanders fan, but he's
Elizabeth
not going to win.
No, he probably won't, and I don't think Elizabeth Warren would either. But you can't tell either what kind of huge reaction there might be to Trump, too. I mean, people might go in another radical direction. To me, good presidents are people like Gerald Ford and Bush the first.
Right.
I kind of like what I think are thoughtful, problem-solving Republicans. That would be my preference, but they're out of style right now in the Republican Party. But you don't know either how much people yearn for stability and normalcy and that sort of thing.
But you've been a successful Republican. You're in
Well,
that
I wouldn't be
category.
anymore,
Do you
John.
see a future for Republicans?
Not
like
for
you?
me, or at least guys like me. I mean, I'm way too old anyway, but I think...
No, I mean young guys.
No, I don't think so. There's one around here. Frank Garner is a member of the House of Representatives from Kalispell, who is an outspoken moderate Republican, is taking a huge chance. And just today in the Daily Interlake, there's one or two letters to the editor just zeroing in on Frank. And he's told me, he said they're going to spend and they're going to do everything they can
What's
to get
his
rid
last
of me.
name? Frank?
Garner, Garner.
I saw those letters.
Did you? Okay, well, Frank said there are probably 10 guys in the whole Montana legislature like him that are moderate or maybe even to some extent sort of little flickers of old Theodore Roosevelt progressive governors or Republicans. And the established Republican Party, I mean, they would have fit right in perfectly.
So those,
When I was there, the ones that are the dangerous moderates now, and there are probably more in the legislature who would too, they just don't have the guts to do it. But the ones that have won, the arch conservatives have decided we're going to get rid of those guys. And they might, I don't know, because Frank's told me that he thinks he's definitely in trouble. They're coming after him and he's the only one in the local legislative delegation. I mean, the rest of them are two Democrats that slipped through, and every other Republican but Frank is a Tea Party hardcore. So I don't know that, I mean, I could even win a Republican primary anymore. I don't think I could, honestly.
Well, you're great. You're our model for this particular part of the discussion. If Al was still alive, I'd go back to Minneapolis and talk to Al Quee, because he's very much like you, even though you've not met him and maybe you've never heard of him.
I've heard of him.
He was great.
Yeah.
He and Ford were close, and he was supposed to possibly be vice president. There was a lot of talk of that. And Gretchen, Al's wife, was not at all eager about that. I mean, she was appalled by Nixon and by what happened. But Al is enough of a politician, and he and Ford were very close. But Al decided not to, and he went back and became governor and was a successful governor until the wrestler came along. But who counts? You know,
And
you never thought of Minnesota as being crazy.
you think of
And then
Minnesota as being about the most civilized state in the country.
Yes.
And then that guy ended up being governor. I know what you mean.
Well, we had Arnie.